They were young, in love, and full of dreams, newlyweds driving into the heart of Oregon's wild beauty for a honeymoon they'd never return from. For years, their disappearance was nothing but a ghost story whispered around campfires. Until a satellite image, decades later, revealed something chilling hidden beneath the trees. But when investigators looked closer, what they found wasn't just a missing couple. It was a secret buried deep in the pines, protected by silence and time. Stay with me, because what starts as a love story turns into something far more haunting and unforgettable. It was the kind of summer day that made people believe in new beginnings. The sun stretched long fingers across Lake Willoughby in northern Oregon, casting golden ripples over the water as the town of Miller's Ridge stirred to life. Locals still speak of that Saturday in June of 1989 as if it happened yesterday. The town was small enough that everyone knew everyone, and everyone knew Sarah Holloway and Michael Whitmore. Childhood friends turned sweethearts. Their love had grown slowly, like ivy climbing a quiet cottage, steady, quiet, and deeply rooted. Michael had been the high school football captain, the kind who never let popularity change him. Sarah was the dreamer, always with a sketchpad or camera in hand, always lost in a thought. Their families had lived next door to each other since the kids were in diapers. Some folks swore the two were meant to end up together from the start. And on that summer day, under an arch of white roses beside the lake where they'd first kissed at 17, they finally did. The ceremony was simple, just the way Sarah had wanted. White folding chairs, twinkle lights dangling from tall pine trees, and the scent of fresh lilac drifting on the breeze. Guests sipped lemonade in mason jars and clapped with teary smiles as the newlyweds danced beneath the stars. Michael's brother gave a toast that had everyone laughing and crying all at once, and Sarah's aunt sang a folk tune that sent shivers through the evening air. There was no grandeur, no pretense, just love, raw and quiet and true. By the end's time, the last slice of cake had been served, and the band began to pack their instruments. Michael and Sarah had changed into jeans and windbreakers, grinning ear to ear. They hugged everyone goodbye and climbed into Michael's prized 1966 Ford pickup, a gift from his late father. The plan was to spend their first night as husband and wife in a cabin owned by a family friend, tucked away deep in the Cascade Mountains. It was a 3-hour drive, most of it winding forest roads with no streetlights and hardly any traffic. Michael had made the trip before for fishing weekends, and Sarah had always loved the woods. The sky was still streaked with pink as they disappeared down the road, waving from the truck windows, laughter trailing behind them like the last note of a lullaby, and then nothing. By morning, when they were expected to call and check in with Michael's mother, Lillian, there was no word. At first, no one panicked. Maybe there was no signal. Maybe they had decided to unplug. But by that evening, when the sun dipped again, and the Whitmores still hadn't returned a single call, Lillian's heart began to thump with a fear she could not explain. By the next day, the authorities had been contacted. Search crews were dispatched into the mountains, scouring dirt roads and ravines, calling out their names into the vast silence of the pines. Helicopters circled the ridges. Volunteers combed the trails. Posters were hung on trees and gas stations. Sarah's father flew in from Arizona. Michael's cousin drove 10 hours overnight to help search. And still nothing. Days turned into weeks. A shoe was found near a riverbed, but didn't match either of theirs. A hunter thought he saw tire tracks near an old fire road, but they led nowhere. Rumors bubbled up through the town like swamp gas. Some whispered the couple had eloped to Canada to escape something. Others speculated about foul play, or wild animals, or even cults that had been rumored to live off-grid in the deeper woods. But none of it made sense to those who knew Michael and Sarah. They were excited, happy, grounded. They had dreams of opening a bed and breakfast someday, of raising kids by the lake. Michael had just been promoted at the county land survey office. Sarah had sold her first photo to a travel magazine. They were not the type to run away. Lillian, especially, refused to believe they had simply vanished. Every day for a year, she lit a candle in the kitchen window and spoke their names out loud, hoping somehow they would hear. Every June 10th, she stood by the lake with 2 roses, one white, one red, and let them drift into the water, whispering prayers as they bobbed and floated away. She kept their room exactly as it had been Sarah's favorite scarf draped over the chair, Michael's shaving kit untouched in the bathroom. She never stopped waiting. Not really. The town, meanwhile, slowly turned the page. The search was called off after 2 months. The case was quietly marked unsolved disappearance, and the world moved on. But beneath the surface, the story lingered like a low hum. People didn't drive that mountain road at night. Teenagers dared each other to camp near the last known location. The wedding photo, Michael's arm around Sarah, her face half lit. By sunset hung in the town library with a small plaque. Gone, but not forgotten. And for 34 long years, that's all they were gone. Until a satellite image, taken by accident, began to whisper a new story from above the trees. The first day of the search was fueled by adrenaline and optimism. Volunteers gathered at dawn near the ranger station with thermoses of coffee, clipboards, and maps. The sheriff coordinated the teams, assigning zones across the dense stretch of the Cascades. The forest was vast, unforgiving in places, a green ocean of silence and shadows. Dogs were brought in, their noses low, sniffing for scent trails. The air buzzed with the sound of choppers above, the hum of radios below. But as the sun set on that first day, without even a footprint found, the mood shifted. The second day brought rain, cold and thin at first, then heavier, making the trails slippery, the forest more unyielding. Tracks, if there were any, would be long washed away. Still, people pressed on, fathers with sons, off-duty firefighters, retired park guides who knew the terrain like the lines on their palms. All of them felt the weight of the mystery pressing in. By the end of the week, the town had become a kind of command post. Flyers with the couple's faces papered every shop window. Gas stations handed out maps to drivers, urging them to keep watch for the old blue pickup. Restaurants served coffee free to searchers. Kids drew pictures of Sarah and Michael in their schoolrooms and taped them up on bulletin boards, like prayers in crayon. But the forest said nothing, no skid marks on the road, no broken branches, no scraps of fabric or glass glinting in the dirt. As July stretched on, the questions began to pile up like leaves left too long in the gutter. Why had they taken that particular road? Did someone lead them there? Had they driven off an embankment too steep for searchers to see? Each theory sprouted its own conspiracy. Some townsfolk whispered about the Whitmore land survey work, wondering if Michael had stumbled on something secret, something someone didn't want revealed. Others blamed the wilderness itself, how easy it was to vanish in Oregon's deep woods. A few even spoke of an old legend about lights seen in the pines and voices echoing without source. It was mostly talk, but behind the talk was a truth no one could deny. Michael and Sarah were gone, and no one knew why. Lillian Whitmore never missed a day by the radio. Her chair was stationed by the window, facing the road, as if watching it long enough would pull her son's truck back into view. The sheriff came by weekly at first, updating her gently, always with the same kind of tone reserved for those facing the unthinkable. After a while, the visit stopped. The case went cold. The funding dried up. The helicopters stopped flying. Searchers went back to work, back to families, back to lives that still had momentum. But Lillian stayed still. Every holiday, she set 2 empty places at the table. She never let dust settle on their wedding photo. Her grief did not look dramatic or loud. It was quiet, patient, and as unshakable as the mountain that it swallowed. Her son. The town itself wore the disappearance like a hidden scar. Tourists still came in the summers, drawn by the beauty of the lake and the hiking trails, unaware of the shadow that loomed over the trees. Locals passed the story along in hushed tones, warning newcomers not to hike too deep without a guide. Teens told the tale of the lost lovers at bonfires, daring each other to go past the mile marker where the couple was last spotted. In time, the legend became part of the town's folklore, softened by time, but never quite forgotten. Some even claimed to have seen Sarah's face in the lake's reflection, or heard Michael's voice in the wind. But most just remembered them as they were two good kids in love, swallowed by the wild. Years turned into decades. Lillian aged, but never gave up. She kept her son's room untouched. She wore Sarah's bracelet around her wrist every Sunday to church. She left notes in the mailbox each June 10th, letters to her son she knew would never be read, but wrote anyway. Other families moved in and out of Miller's Ridge. New names appeared on the mailbox slots at the general store. The town changed. In many ways, but the story stayed. It was etched into the rhythm of local life, mentioned with reverence, with the sadness that comes from not knowing how a story ends. Then, one morning in early spring of 2023, a man across the state sat at his kitchen table with a second cup of coffee and an open laptop. His name was Roy Chandler, and he was looking at satellite images of the forest near Miller's Ridge for an entirely different reason. But what he saw, what he zoomed in on with an idle curiosity, was the first crack in a silence that had lasted 34 long years. A rust-colored blur, oddly shaped, nestled in the tree cover. Something that didn't quite belong. Something that had been hiding in plain sight, just waiting for the right set of eyes. Roy Chandler had never been the kind of man drawn to mysteries. At 71, he preferred the kind of puzzles that had answers old crosswords, forgotten trail maps, the predictable rituals of retired life in the quiet suburbs of Portland. A former high school teacher turned amateur historian, Roy spent his mornings sipping coffee in a sunlit nook, poring over dusty volumes of Oregon's early logging routes and forgotten settlements. His latest project, a passion more than a duty, was maintaining a blog dedicated to forest preservation in the Pacific Northwest. He had no audience to speak of, maybe a dozen loyal readers, but that didn't matter. For Roy, the joy was in the research and stitching together stories from fractured history and lost terrain. On one particular Tuesday morning in April of 2023, with the scent of rain drifting through his open kitchen window and a fresh pot of black coffee cooling beside him, Roy opened a new browser tab and clicked over to a satellite mapping tool he used often. He'd read a tip online about a suspicious clear-cut area outside the Cascade boundaries, possibly the result of illegal logging. Curious and methodical, he began scanning section by section, moving pixel by pixel across the lush digital canopy, pausing occasionally to mark coordinates that might need follow-up. He didn't expect to find anything. He rarely did. But something about the image in Quadrant 41C made him stop. There, nestled within a stretch of particularly dense pine, was a shape that tugged at his mind like a half-remembered name. At first glance, it looked like a rust-colored smudge, half obscured by shadow and the layering of trees. But as he zoomed in, adjusting the contrast and shifting the date stamp, the outline sharpened. It wasn't a natural formation. It had hard edges, curved metal corners, the telltale symmetry of something man-made. Roy leaned closer, squinting. It looked like the roof of a vehicle, maybe an old truck buried beneath years of forest growth. He clicked through previous satellite images, going back year by year. In 2020, there was nothing. In 2021, a faint edge. By 2022, The full outline appeared as the trees above it thinned ever so slightly, possibly from storm damage or rot. Roy's breath slowed. He'd stumbled on long-lost wrecks before, abandoned sheds, collapsed hunting cabins, but this felt different. There was something eerie about how perfectly the forest had hidden it until now. For a long moment, he simply stared at the screen, caught between logic and instinct. He copied the coordinates into a notepad and spent the rest of the day combing through forestry reports, old land use maps, and even social media posts by local hikers. Nothing matched. The area was considered off-trail and rarely accessed. He emailed the satellite company, posing as a journalist and requesting higher resolution frames from the past 3 years. While he waited, he tried not to jump to conclusions. Maybe it was just an old hunting vehicle. Maybe it had been dragged there during a flood or left decades ago by someone who'd moved away. Still, something in Roy's gut urged him forward. A quiet voice that whispered this was worth looking into. 3 days later, the satellite company responded. The image files they sent were sharper, cleaner, and what Roy saw in them turned his quiet interest into annoying curiosity. The truck was definitely old mid-60s by the look of the body shape, and it hadn't moved in years. The canopy above had begun to collapse, letting in more light, which explained why it had only recently become visible. But there was more. Just outside the truck's left side, in the undergrowth, was a vague outline. 2 shadows, side by side. Too symmetrical to be fallen logs. Roy leaned back, his heart thudding now, not from fear, but the electric buzz of discovery. Something about the whole scene, the isolation of the location, the way time had erased it from memory. It all felt heavy with story. Roy decided to call someone who might know more. A few years back, he'd done a podcast interview with a local forest ranger named Glenn Davies, who worked out of a station not far from Miller's Ridge. Glenn was practical, no nonsense, and respected by hikers and hunters alike. When Roy explained what he'd found, Glenn was skeptical at first, suggesting it might be an abandoned equipment trailer. But when Roy mentioned the make of the truck, possibly a 1966 Ford, Glenn's tone changed. There had been a case, years ago, from that area. A couple that went missing. Young. Newlyweds. Glenn didn't know the details, only that the story still haunted a few old-timers in town. Intrigued now beyond reason, Roy proposed they check it out together. Glenn hesitated. It wasn't an official investigation, and the terrain would be rough. But Roy was persistent, and finally, Glenn agreed. They made plans to meet the following week, armed with maps, GPS trackers, and a determination that neither could fully explain. Roy didn't tell his readers what he was doing. He didn't tell his sister, or his bridge group, or even his mailman, who he usually chatted with about his blog projects. Something about this felt too fragile to speak aloud. Like saying it might scare it off, send the truth fluttering back into the trees. That night, Roy sat in bed with the satellite images spread out like a crime board, lit by the soft glow of his desk lamp. He traced the truck's outline again and again, then the 2 shadows, then the dense circle of trees that had kept them secret all these years. He didn't know what he would find out there, but he knew this wasn't just about a lost vehicle. Something had been waiting to be seen. And maybe, just maybe, he was the one who was meant to see it. Roy met Glenn Davies early on a cool morning that felt more like fall than spring. The kind of Oregon day when the air held both the promise of discovery and the threat of rain. The ranger station stood quietly at the edge of Miller's Ridge, unchanged. In years, its walls faded and flaking, the American flag out front stirring gently in the breeze. Glenn, in his late 50s, had the weathered face of someone who knew how to listen to forests. He wore his ranger uniform like armor and shook Roy's hand with a steady grip, his eyes sharp but kind. They spread the maps out across the hood of Glenn's truck, tracing the coordinates Roy had found and estimating the best route to approach the site. The terrain wasn't welcoming steep slopes, no marked trails, patches of undergrowth, thick enough to swallow a man whole. But Glenn nodded thoughtfully, then pulled out a compass like he was accepting a challenge from the past. They drove as far as the forestry road would take them, the truck bouncing over rocks and roots, passing rusted, no trespassing signs, and the bleached skeletons of old logging equipment long since abandoned. When the road dissolved into brush, they loaded their packs, shouldered their gear, and began the hike-in. Roy hadn't bushwhacked like this in years, but something inside him felt startlingly alive. The pain in his knees dulled by the sense that he was walking toward an answer buried beneath decades of silence. Glenn moved with the patience of someone who respected the wilderness, pausing often, listening to birdsong, noting broken branches that hinted at deer or elk. For hours they trudged uphill, weaving through thick tree cover, the forest closing. And like a secret, the deeper they walked, the quieter everything became, until the world shrank to their footsteps, their breath, the creak of old bark overhead. Then, just after noon, Glenn stopped. It pointed through a break in the trees. There, half sunken into the earth, its frame swallowed by moss and leaf litter, sat the truck, a blue Ford, or what was left of it. Rust painted the doors like decay creeping up bone. The windshield was gone, shattered long ago, and vines threaded through the cab like veins. Nature had claimed it, made it part of itself, but it was unmistakable. Roy felt a chill as he stepped closer, his boots crunching softly on pine needles. This wasn't just an abandoned vehicle. This was the one from the story. The truck that had left the wedding with two people in love and never come back. They didn't speak at first. There was reverence in the air, a hush that demanded silence. Glenn moved to the passenger side, gently brushing away debris from the window frame. Then he froze. "Roy," he said quietly, his voice hoarse. "Look." Inside the cab, just visible, through the layers of time, were two skeletons, still seated, still side by side. Their bones pale against the dark interior, their posture undisturbed, as if they'd never moved from where they sat. One skull rested against the other's shoulder. Glenn swallowed hard and radioed it in, speaking in clipped tones, his rangers. Discipline kicking in. Roy stood back, heart pounding, eyes fixed on the open doorway to a 34-year-old mystery. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt hollowed out, like something vast had opened beneath him. Authorities arrived within hours. A new crew of younger deputies and forensic specialists, their voices low, their faces solemn. Yellow tape went up. Samples were taken. Photographs. Captured every angle. And the forest watched, unmoved. A local deputy, grayer than the rest, came up to Roy later and asked how he'd found the place. When Roy explained, the man just nodded slowly, like he'd known something like this would come eventually. "You just stirred up a ghost that never rested," he said quietly. News vans descended by morning, their vans kicking up dust on the old fire road. Reporters stuck microphones into the mist, eager for sound bites. "Missing newlyweds found after 3 decades," one headline. Read, "Tragedy in the trees." But even as the facts were confirmed, dental records matched. The couple's IDs, found intact in a sealed glove compartment, questions began to form like fog. Why had the truck ended up so far from the cabin they were meant to reach? Why had no one found it before, despite dozens of search parties? And why did it seem like they had gone willingly into the woods that night, taking a road not on any map, driving until the forest swallowed them whole? The townsfolk reacted with a mix of relief and unease. For years, the Whitmore story had been a sad tale told at lake picnics, the kind of mystery people repeated over coffee, wrapped in soft speculation. Now, The truth had weight, and it sat heavy on the town's shoulders. People returned to the lake again, older now, with white in their hair and lines on their faces. They lit candles, left notes, stared across the water, as if expecting Sarah and Michael to walk out of the woods holding hands. Lillian Whitmore, now nearing 90, was brought to the scene in a wheelchair, flanked by friends who had grown old. Waiting with her, she looked at the truck for a long time. Then she whispered, "They didn't run." I always knew they didn't run. That night, Rui sat alone back at his motel, the window open to the sound of wind rustling through pine. He stared at the photographs he'd taken earlier, unable to sleep. The image that haunted him most wasn't the truck or the skeletons. It was the way their bones sat so close together, as if even in death, they had held on to one another. It wasn't just a tragedy buried in the woods. It was a love story, one cut short but never severed. And Roy knew this was only the beginning. The forest had finally spoken. Now it was time to listen. The discovery hit Miller's Ridge like a bell rung in the center of a quiet church, reverberating through every hallway, shaking dust from rafters, long undisturbed. Word traveled fast, faster than anyone expected. By mid-morning, neighbors who hadn't spoken in years were leaning over fences again, murmuring memories and old rumors like co-conspirators. Sarah and Michael Whitmore, the couple everyone had loved and lost, had been found. Not alive, but no longer lost. And for many in town, that distinction mattered more than they'd imagined. It was as if a long-held breath had finally been released. A tightness unknotted in the chest of the community. For years, their story had been passed down like a ghost tale told under dim porch lights. Now, it was real again, achingly real. And with its return came a flood of remembrance that no one could hold back. At the local diner, where morning coffee had long been accompanied by quiet radio and crossword puzzles, people now clustered. In booths with folded newspapers spread wide, eyes wide and teary. Hazel Simmons, who had catered their wedding cake, kept her apron on all day and retold the story of how Sarah had insisted on lemon with raspberry filling because Michael hated chocolate, though he never told anyone. Pastor James reopened the church on a weekday just so people could sit and be still, light candles, whisper names, cry without explanation. Children who had only ever heard the Whitmores mentioned in bedtime stories now stared in awe at the photographs, suddenly tacked to bulletin boards and taped to the inside of shop windows. A black and white image of Sarah laughing, wind in her hair, sat beside one of Michael in his baseball uniform, squinting against the sun. They looked so young, so alive. It was almost too much to take in. The town council called an emergency meeting, not out of necessity but ritual, as if acknowledging the past officially might help the present make sense of itself. They decided to host a memorial, not a funeral. No, something gentler, something that felt like a welcome home. A gathering by the lake where it had all begun, where vows had been spoken under rose-covered arches now lost to time. The lake, wide and still, had watched it all and held its silence for more than 3 decades. Now it would bear witness again. But as the town embraced the return of its lost children, deeper undercurrents began to stir. Not everyone was content to let the story settle with a tragic bow. Questions had surfaced that no headline could answer. Why had Michael and Sarah's truck been found so far off the route to the cabin? The road leading to that stretch of forest wasn't even listed on maps. The couple was familiar with the area, or they wouldn't have wandered aimlessly. And why was there no sign of impact, no evidence of a crash or slide? The vehicle appeared to have been parked deliberately, tucked under the trees, like someone had meant for it to remain hidden. The sheriff's office released a brief statement, citing the advanced decay and weathering as a challenge to determining cause of death. Foul play couldn't be ruled out, but neither could 100 other possibilities. The bodies, though protected within the vehicle, offered few answers beyond confirmation of identity. No signs of trauma were immediately visible. It was, for now, an open conclusion to a closed case. Still, not everyone could let it rest. Old-timers like Bert Callahan, who had led one of the early search parties, found themselves pulled back into the what-ifs. Bert remembered the ravine he'd walked a dozen times in '89, the scent of smoke from nearby fires, the exhaustion that blurred days together. How had they missed it? How had they walked within half a mile of the truck and seen nothing? Some pointed to the density of the undergrowth, the way nature could erase man's footprints faster than snowfall. Others shook their heads and whispered of things deeper than reason. A few even muttered that the forest had kept its secret because it wasn't ready to let go. Not until now, Roy Chandler returned to town that weekend, this time not as an outsider, peering through the lens of history, but as a participant in something living and raw. At the lake, he met Lillian Whitmore again, the matriarch of a wound finally allowed to heal. She thanked him quietly, her voice a rasp, her fingers thin but steady as they gripped his hand. "You were meant to find them," she said, eyes holding his. Somehow, you heard them when the rest of the world stopped listening. Roy didn't have a response. There were no words big enough for what he felt. Only a deep, humbled silence. That Sunday, as the sun slid behind the western ridge, casting long fingers of gold across the lake's surface, the town gathered. People brought flowers and framed photos, old love letters, and scribbled notes tied to ribbons. Children placed drawings in baskets. Elderly neighbors stood arm in arm, remembering. There were no speeches, no music, just the rustle of wind through pine and the gentle lapping of water. 2 lanterns were lit and set adrift, floating slowly into the darkening distance, bobbing like twin stars returned to sky. And though one said it aloud, everyone felt the same thing, that something sacred had come full circle. The past had found its way home. Even as the town breathed a collective sigh and let the story of Sarah and Michael settle gently into memory, a quieter, more restless current began to wind its way beneath the surface. It started not with suspicion, but with discomfort, feeling that something, though beautifully resolved on the outside, still didn't sit right deep in the bones. For most of Miller's Ridge, closure meant peace, the kind that finally lets people sleep through the night without waking to what-ifs. But for a few, particularly those who had lived longest with the story, the details of the discovery did more to stir than soothe. They began asking questions, not loudly and not publicly, but in corners of kitchens and over phone lines that stretched across states. Why, after all these years, had the truck remained untouched, unspoiled, as if the forest had chosen to protect it? Why was the position of the body so eerily serene, as though no panic or struggle had occurred in their final moments? And why had their destination, a cabin just 2 hours away, never been reached when they knew the road by heart? For Sheriff Darnell Price, who had taken over the department just 2 years earlier, the questions came with quiet pressure. He had inherited the files from the old sheriff, whose notes were handwritten and yellowing, stored in a metal cabinet. That squeaked every time it opened. Most of the case was interviews, maps, early search reports, and the usual grainy photographs of wedding smiles and forest paths. But what troubled Darnell was not what was in the file, it was what was missing. There had been no definitive last sighting beyond the wedding send-off. No clear time of disappearance. No forensic evidence ever collected until now. It was a black hole wrapped in fog, and even now the remains told very little. Toxicology was useless after so many years. Weather and time had erased most clues, but one thing gnawed at Darnell harder than the rest. When the state crime lab examined the truck's interior, they noted the ignition key was still turned halfway, as if someone had meant to start the truck, but hadn't. That small detail suggested intent movement interrupted. But by what? Roy Chandler, meanwhile, had returned home to Portland and tried to resume his normal routine, but the questions followed him like persistent shadows. He found himself going back over the satellite images, retracing every shift in tree cover, every slight glint of metal. He'd reread the old blog posts he'd written about the forest geography and even called Glenn Davies late one evening just to ask again about the stretch of road the truck had been found on. Glenn was polite but tired. "Roy," he said with a weary sigh, "sometimes things go quiet for a reason. Sometimes the woods don't want you to know." But Roy couldn't let it go, not entirely. He visited the county archives, digging through old forestry maps from the 1970s and 80s. What he found startled him. The path where the truck had ended up didn't appear on any official documents before 1992. It had been carved into the land later, likely for private use, possibly logging, but no records explained who authorized it or when. This meant one thing: Sarah and Michael had either taken a path that didn't yet exist when they disappeared, or they were taken there later. That revelation hit Roy like a stone dropped into still water. Either possibility cracked open something he hadn't been prepared for. And then came the letter. It arrived in a plain envelope with no return address, slid under his apartment door, while he was out at the grocery store. The handwriting was tight, neat, written in blue ink. It read, "You're not wrong. People know more than they ever said. Ask about the Reeves place. Start there." Roy read it 3 times, befolding it carefully and placing it into his notebook. The name meant nothing to him at first, but a quick search turned up an old estate deed from the 1980s, a plot of land roughly 15 miles from where the truck had been found, once owned by a man named Chester Reeves, who had died in 1991. The property had since changed hands several times and was now privately fenced with no public access. But in old newspaper clippings, Roy found reference to a dispute between the Reeves family and the county planning board regarding road development and land rights. That dispute, filed quietly, aligned eerily with the time of the couple's disappearance. The question now wasn't just where Sarah and Michael had gone. It was whether someone had guided them there, whether someone had made sure they wouldn't return. Roy knew he was stepping into dangerous territory, the kind where answers come wrapped in silence, protected by time and fear. But once a door like that is opened, it doesn't close easily. He reached out to Glenn one last time, asking about the Reeves place. This time, Glenn didn't answer. Days passed. Then a short message came. "Roy, let it be. That road was never meant to be found." But Roy was no longer just a curious retiree. He had become the keeper of a truth, unraveling slowly, painfully, through the quiet cracks of a story that had refused to die. And somewhere inside him, he felt it again, that same pull that had led him to the satellite image in the first place. A quiet voice, a call unanswered. And now, a past not quite finished. With him, yet. Roy Chandler had never considered himself a man easily drawn to obsession, but in the weeks following the anonymous letter, his mind refused to let the matter rest. Something about the name, the Reeves place, clung to him like mist on mountain. Mark. It wasn't just that it hinted at more than chance in the Whitmore's disappearance, or that the old estate had sat close to the path the couple had never meant to travel. It was that someone had known to point him there, quietly, deliberately, as though trusting Roy to pull a thread too delicate for louder hands. He began to dig deeper, not out of paranoia, but because the story no longer felt finished. If it had ever been a story at all, it was beginning to feel more like a buried truth. The Reeves name had once carried quiet weight in the region, especially among the old landowners and timber contractors who operated just outside the reach of state oversight. Chester Reeves, the original patriarch, had come to Oregon in the 1950s with money from a lumber inheritance and an appetite for ownership. He bought up parcels of forest land one by one, building a small empire of leased tracts and gated roads, some legal, others not so much. Records were sparse, often handwritten, scattered through old boxes in county basements. Roy spent days in the archives, scanning property deeds, council disputes, even newspaper birth announcements. What he found stitched a subtle but damning portrait. Reeves had a reputation for secrecy. Multiple reports from the late 70s described his resistance to road inspections and his refusal to allow surveyors on his land. One article mentioned a zoning complaint filed after a road was cut through his lower property without a permit. The road, according to that complaint, ran suspiciously close to where Michael and Sarah's truck had been found. Roy highlighted that map section and circled it 3 times in red ink. If Reeves had built an unrecorded road back then, and if that road had still been accessible in 1989, it could explain how the Whitmores had ended up there. But why would they take it? Unless they hadn't taken it of their own will. Unless someone had led them there, knowingly or not. Roy didn't want to believe it. The belief no longer mattered. Only facts. He needed to speak to someone who remembered Reeves personally, and for that, he turned to the last name in a long list of former planning commissioners, a man named Curtis Haverfield, 92 years old. Living in a care facility near Salem. Curtis was sharper than Roy expected, with blue eyes that missed nothing and a voice like gravel stirred in whiskey. When Roy mentioned the Reeves property, Curtis's eyes narrowed. He waved Roy closer and spoke low. That man built more than roads. He built walls. Invisible ones. Paid good money to keep people out and certain things quiet. Roy pressed him for details, but Curtis only shook his head. Back then, we didn't ask questions we weren't ready to carry. But there was one incident early summer of '89. Same year, your couple disappeared. Reeves came into the council chamber one morning furious about trespassers on his land. Claimed someone had broken a gate, said things had been disturbed. He never said what things, and no one asked. Roy left with his pulse thudding. He drove the long way home, through winding forest roads, passing beneath canopies that suddenly felt heavier than before. That same week, he received a second envelope, this one bearing a single black and white photograph inside. It showed an old gate, rusted and half collapsed, with a wooden sign nailed to the post. Private land. No entry. Roy recognized the terrain from satellite images just east of where the truck had been found. On the back of the photo, in the same careful handwriting, was written, "This gate was open that night. Ask Glenn." He didn't want to. He'd already pushed Glenn once, and the warning had been clear. But something told him the ranger knew more than he'd admitted. Roy drove to Miller's Ridge that weekend, unannounced, and found Glenn at the ranger station, loading gear into his truck. The air between them was brittle with unspoken tension. When Roy showed him the photo, Glenn didn't speak for a long time. Finally, he exhaled sharply and leaned against the tailgate. "I was on duty that night," Glenn said quietly. "Back in '89. I didn't mention it before because I thought it didn't matter anymore. I was young, just learning the ropes. That night, I saw headlights go up the Reeves trail. Thought it was a poacher or a logger. I followed. But by the time I got to the fork, the gate was shut again. Locked, like nothing had passed through. I radioed it in, but no one responded. It was a weird night fog rolled in thick. I waited, then left. Figured it was nothing." Roy felt his chest tighten. "You think it was them?" "I don't know," Glenn said, his voice barely a whisper. "But I've thought about it every year since." That night, Roy sat in his motel room, the photograph lying on the bed beside his notes, and realized the story wasn't buried in time. It had been buried in silence. In decisions not to speak, in roads deliberately left off maps, in records, quietly lost or burned. The truth wasn't just hidden by the forest. It had been helped along by those who had chosen not to look. Long before drones and satellites offered eyes in the sky, the forests around Miller's Ridge had only ever been documented by the feet that walked them and the lenses that dared to capture their secrets. Back in the summer of 1989, just days before, Sarah and Michael Whitmore vanished. A young freelance photographer named Caleb Dunn had been hired by the state's tourism board to gather wilderness shots for a new campaign called Oregon Untouched. Caleb was 28 then, fresh from school, more artist than documentarian, and driven by the quiet fire of someone determined to frame the world in a way no one else had seen it. He spent weeks trekking through the Cascades, living out of his old Jeep, hiking trails no one remembered, and following the fading light with a camera that weighed more than his pack. He didn't know anything about the Whitmores at the time. Not until years later, when their names became embedded in local lore and the memory of their disappearance settled into the trees like mist. But Caleb had seen something, and for reasons he couldn't explain, he hadn't said a word. It wasn't guilt that kept him silent. It was uncertainty. A single photo he'd taken on the final morning of his trip, just east of the Reeves property line, had always felt wrong to him. Not because of what was in it, but because of what shouldn't have been. He remembered it clearly. The air was thick with dew, the sky barely gray with dawn, and he'd been using a long lens to capture the curve of an old service road cutting through the trees. He only took one frame, just before the fog rolled in. When he developed the negatives weeks later, that particular image struck him as odd. At first glance, it was a study in solitude, just the soft green of pine, the dirt road stretching into the distance, and morning light filtering down like threads of gold. But in the lower right-hand corner, almost invisible, sat what looked like the corner of a car's front bumper chrome, catching the light faintly, parked where no car should be. He had stared at it for a long time, unsure whether it was anything at all. A trick of reflection, maybe. A logging marker. An illusion. He never submitted that photo. Something told him not to. Caleb moved on. He got married, had kids, worked weddings and architectural jobs. His career moved toward comfort, his days shaped by normalcy, but that one photo never left him. He kept the original negative in a separate envelope, tucked into an old shoebox, telling himself it didn't matter. Until one afternoon in 2023, when he read a news article that stopped him cold. A hiker had found a satellite image of an old truck buried in forest not far from Miller's Ridge. The remains of two missing newlyweds had been identified inside. And suddenly, the past knocked with cold knuckles. He reached out to the sheriff's office first, then to the ranger station. Neither gave him a straight answer. He offered to come in, show the photograph. They thanked him and promised to call. They didn't, but Roy Chandler did. When Roy arrived at Caleb's small photo studio outside Eugene, he carried nothing but a notebook and a quiet urgency that Caleb recognized immediately. They talked for over an hour, Roy listening carefully, as Caleb told the story of that morning in '89 and the photo he had never shared. Then, wordlessly, Caleb retrieved the envelope, pulled out the glossy print, and slid it across the table. Roy studied it with slow reverence, the same way one might study a final letter from someone long gone. It wasn't conclusive. The bumper was faint, partially obscured by brush and early light, but it was there. And more haunting, still trailing up the dirt road behind it, were faint tire tracks. 2 sets, perfectly aligned, and the distinct impression of something heavier being dragged or pushed. Where exactly did you take this? Roy asked, voice low. Caleb pointed to the map Roy unfolded, his finger landing just a mile southeast of where the Whitmore truck had been found. He hadn't even realized how close he'd been. That day in 1989, he had walked down the road after the photo, found nothing, and turned back. But that truck, it might have already been there. And he had been within earshot. That realization filled the room with a sudden weight. Caleb sat back, rubbing his eyes. "All these years," he murmured, "and I didn't know what I saw." Roy didn't blame him. In fact, he admired him. Because unlike others, Caleb had held on to what he'd seen, had preserved it quietly, patiently, waiting for the right moment to bring it forward. They sat in silence for a while, the photo between them like a shared secret passed down too late. Then Roy folded the map, slipped the photo back into the envelope, and stood. "Caleb," he said, "what you saw might change everything." And as he drove back north through the same ridgelines that had held the Whitmores for 34 years, Roy felt the pieces shift. The bumper, the tracks, the gate that had been open, then locked. There had been movement that night. Intentional, deliberate movement. Someone had known where to go. Someone had led them there. Or someone had followed. And now that someone's silence was beginning to crack. There was something about returning to the woods after all the questions had started, forming sharp edges in his mind that made Roy feel like he was stepping into a memory not entirely his. The trees swayed softly, casting long, deliberate shadows. Across the path, he and Glenn followed, and each crunch of the earth beneath their boots felt louder than it should have been, as if the land itself was listening now. They hadn't spoken much on the drive out. Glenn had agreed to come only after Roy showed him the photograph, the one Caleb had kept hidden for decades, and a page from the old county records. The one Roy had highlighted with shaking hands when he saw the faint surveyor's note from 1988, scribbled in the margin with the words, "Access Road below Eastern Ridge, Prob. Temporary." That same ridge, now in front of them, rose like a knuckle in the forest's spine, modest in size but ancient in presence. And Roy could feel it even before they reached the slope where the trail should have been. The maps didn't show it. The official topography called this stretch undisturbed. But the forest told a different story, and Glenn seemed to know it too. He glanced sideways at Roy, his face older than it had looked the day before, and nodded toward a patch of thick underbrush where no path was visible to the untrained eye. "It used to be here," he said, barely above a whisper, "before the pines took it back." They pushed through a curtain of saplings and found themselves on what remained of a narrow, rutted trail half consumed by time and moss, the imprint of tire grooves still visible if you looked close enough. As they followed the curve of the hill downward, the pines thickened, closing in from either side, their branches low, tangled with vines that whispered secrets as the wind curled through them. It felt like walking into a place nature had tried hard to forget. But the forest remembers everything. It just doesn't always give up what it knows without a price. After nearly 30 minutes of slow descent, Roy saw it. Half buried in ivy and broken branches, a rusted marker post jutted from the ground at an angle, its paint long since eroded, its metal flaked by decades of quiet rain. Glenn stopped beside it, exhaled slowly, and tapped it with his boot. "It used to be right here," he muttered. "Chain link, private entry. Reeves installed it himself. I only saw it once, back when I was green. Never forgot where it sat." Roy stood very still, letting the moment settle over him like snowfall. This wasn't just a hidden road. It was a decision, a choice made to lead somewhere specific, somewhere someone didn't want found. And Reeves, with all his paranoia and his obsession with control, had left just enough of a trail for someone like Roy to follow all these years later. They moved past the marker, deeper still, the trail narrowing until it vanished into what looked like solid earth It was, in fact, a sloping depression lined with old timber boards, rotted and blackened by age. Glenn crouched, brushed aside patch of leaves, and uncovered a section of steel hatch, rectangular, bolted shut, barely visible unless you were looking for it. Storm shelter, Glenn said quietly, or so he claimed. But no one's been down there in decades. With effort, they pried the hatch open, rust flaking away like dried blood, and a stale wind rushed up from below. Roy descended first, flashlight in hand, the beam cutting through layers of dust that danced like ash in the confined air. The room beneath was small, lined with wooden crates stacked unevenly against the concrete walls, their labels faded and smeared. A desk stood in the corner, and on it, a single ledger lay open to a page dated June 1989. Roy stepped closer, heart hammering, and read the entry. Delivery scheduled. Confirmed arrival. M&S escort confirmed. He blinked, staring at the looping script, then flipped backward through the page's entries repeated week after week. Names and initials, routes noted, arrival times marked. This wasn't a storm shelter. This was a record. A ledger of movements. A logbook for operations no one had ever reported, hidden beneath the pines, never intended for light again. Glenn moved beside him, silent, until he finally asked, "You think they were brought here?" Roy didn't answer. He didn't need to. The forest had already spoken. The answer lay in the paper, in the road, in the photograph, in the forgotten path beneath these trees. Someone had directed Sarah and Michael off their wedding road and into this web deliberately, calculatingly. They weren't lost. They were rerouted, used, maybe, sacrificed, even, but not forgotten. Not anymore. The night after they returned from the hidden shelter, Roy sat alone in his motel room with the ledger spread across the bed like a sacred text, its pages brittle and stained, whispering more than they wrote. Each entry felt like a loose stitch in a fabric too long left unexamined. He read the initials again, Emmons repeated across a series of days leading up to June 17th, 1989, the date of the Whitmore's wedding. There were no surnames, but there didn't need to be. He knew who they were. That ledger, buried beneath pine and rot, was never meant to see light. And that made the discovery of the envelope on his doorstep the following morning all the more disturbing. No knock, no footsteps. Just a plain manila envelope with his name printed in blocky, uppercase letters, Roy Chandler, placed neatly beneath his doorframe, like it had grown out of the ground. He opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a letter. A single page, yellowed. At the edges, but not aged by time, aged by fire. The top left corner was scorched, its ash-black edge curling like an old leaf. But the writing was clear, typed on a machine from another era, the kind that left slightly raised impressions in the paper. Roy sat down and began to read. To whom it may concern, if you're reading this, then the wrong thing has finally been found. I don't know who you are, or how close you've come, but I imagine if this page made it out, you're closer than anyone ever should be. What happened to them wasn't meant for the public. It wasn't a murder, and it wasn't an accident. It was a mistake, a miscommunication, the kind that gets buried because it's easier to forget than to explain. They weren't the targets. They were in the wrong place at the wrong time, and someone made a decision to keep it quiet. You need to understand that what you're trying to unravel touches people who are still very much alive and still very capable of making sure things stay quiet. You can choose now. Let it go. Walk away. Or keep going and learn what I learned. Truth doesn't always give peace. Sometimes it only takes more. There was no signature, no return address. Just a page and a folded photocopy of what looked like a transportation requisition form, also dated June 1989. It listed vehicle numbers, cargo codes, destinations, and in red pen circled in the bottom margin, a scribbled note. Delay at Gate 3. Unauthorized detour. Reassess Reeves Protocol. That word again, Reeves. The shadow that seemed to linger behind every corner of this puzzle. But what gripped Roy wasn't the content of the form, nor even the thinly veiled thread inside the letter. It was the implication. Someone out there knew what he was doing. Someone was watching, and that someone had access to documents that had long since been scrubbed from official records. Worse still, someone believed Sarah and Michael had been collateral, not victims of malice, but of mismanagement. As if that made their disappearance any less devastating. As if that could justify 34 years of silence, Roy placed the papers back in the envelope, sealed it again, and stared at it for a long time. Every instinct in him warred between caution and resolve. He could walk away. No one would blame him. The authorities had their story now. The town had closure. Families had graves to visit. But something inside him refused to settle. It wasn't just about what had happened. It was about how easily it had been erased, how neatly it had been tucked under the weight of bureaucracy, fear, and time. He thought of Sarah's smile in the wedding photos, the way her fingers had curled gently around Michael's arm, and of the way Michael had looked at her like she was the only thing that mattered in the world. They had trusted the road ahead. They had believed in their beginning. And someone had made sure the beginning ended before it even had a chance to bloom. He dialed. Glenn told him about the letter. Glenn didn't sound surprised. His voice was quiet, resigned. "They tried to warn me once," he said. "Back in '92, I filed a report about the road. They came to my house that night, 2 men in suits, not from around here. Told me I was mistaken. Told me it would be best if I stopped looking. I didn't stop, not really. I just stopped telling anyone what I found. That admission settled heavy between them. It wasn't just about Reeves anymore. It hadn't been for a long time. This went beyond a family, beyond a patch of forest, beyond one ruined wedding day. It was about control, secrets, the lengths people would go to keep their mistakes buried." Roy hung up, made a copy of the letter, and locked the original inside his suitcase. Then he opened his notebook and turned to a blank page. At the top, in clean script, he wrote, "If anything happens to me," and began to write, not because he expected danger, but because he understood now that the closer you came to truth, the more it demanded, the more it cost. And some truths, no matter how long they stay buried, will claw their way to the surface, letter by letter, root by root, until silence is no longer possible. Morning came quietly in Miller's Ridge, the kind of gentle light that filtered through the trees like a benediction, soft and golden, brushing against the rooftops and damp forest floor as if trying not to disturb anything that hadn't already stirred. Roy stood alone on the ridge, overlooking the valley below, the notebook pressed against his side like a compass that no longer needed pointing. The trail behind him was the same one he and Glenn had followed days ago, the same one Sarah and Michael had unknowingly been led down more than 30 years before. But today it felt different, lighter, somehow, as if the woods, after decades of silence, had finally exhaled word of what Roy had found, what they had both uncovered, had spread quietly at first. Not in newspapers or evening news segments, but in whispers and phone calls, shared glances at coffee counters and hesitant conversations on front porches. The kind of news that didn't stir panic, only a deeper reflection. The sheriff's department had accepted the ledger and the documents, though no official statement was released. No arrests were made, no one named. But Roy had noticed too. Men from the state government stepping into the ranger station early one morning. Not in uniforms, but in gray suits and clean shoes that didn't belong in forest dust. Glenn had seen them too. Neither of them spoke of it. They didn't need to. Some things were still protected. Some walls, even when cracked, didn't crumble. And yet, Despite all the questions that would never be answered, something remarkable happened in the days that followed. The town came together, quietly, almost reverently, to do the one thing they had never had the chance to do: say goodbye. A small service was held in the chapel downtown. Not grand, not overly formal. Just a gathering of friends, old classmates, neighbors who still remembered the way Sarah had laughed at the diner, or the way Michael used to wave from the bench outside the hardware store. The caskets, simple, light-colored wood, were placed side by side near the altar, each draped with a cloth of pine green, a symbol of where they had been lost and where they had been found. Roy sat in the back pew, alone, letting the moment wash over him. Not grief exactly, something softer. Something like peace. After the service, he walked to the edge of the cemetery where Glenn was waiting. They said little, just stood under the old cedar tree that had watched over the town longer than any man. Finally, Glenn said, "You gave them something no one else ever could." Roy didn't answer. He only nodded, the words too large to fit in his throat. He thought of the letter in his suitcase, the one that warned him away, the one he hadn't shown anyone but had copied and sent to 2 separate law offices just in case. He thought of the trapdoor hidden beneath the ridge, of the names and dates carved in cold, secret ink, of the gate that now hung open, rusted but no longer locked. And he thought of Caleb's photo, the chrome glint, the forgotten road, how one quiet moment frozen in time had started something unstoppable. That evening, Roy returned to the place where the Whitmores had been found. He stood beside the truck now cordoned off and marked as historical evidence, a small plaque already in place at the edge of the clearing, courtesy of the local heritage board. It read, "In memory of Sarah and Michael Whitmore, lost but never forgotten, 1989. Beneath it, carved into the stone base, were Sarah's last words from her wedding vow, which someone must have remembered and submitted. "Where you go, I will go." Roy touched the stone, fingers trailing across the letters, and for the first time in months, felt the weight in his chest loosen. It wasn't just about uncovering the truth. It never really had been. It was about listening to the silence long enough to understand what it had been trying to say all along. The forest hadn't hidden them out of cruelty. It had kept them safe in its own quiet way, until someone came looking not for answers, but for understanding. And now, with their story known, their names spoken again with love and not fear, it was time to let them rest. On his final night in Miller's Ridge, Roy sat beside the motel window, watching the pines sway in the dust breeze, and thought of all the stories that would never be told, those that had disappeared in the gaps between memory and record, in the shadows cast by old decisions. He would leave in the morning, not because the work was done, but because the path forward was no longer his to walk. Others would pick it up now, piece by piece, with new eyes and new questions. And that was enough. He closed the notebook, turned off the light, and let the stillness take him, not as an ending but as a promise that sometimes, even after all, hope has gone quiet, the truth finds its way home through the pines. And so, through the quiet rustling of the pines and the long-forgotten whispers of the past, Sarah and Michael's story finally found its way home. It reminds us that even in the deepest silence, the truth waits patiently to be heard. Some stories are never truly lost. They just need someone to listen. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end of this journey. If this story touched you in any way, I'd truly appreciate it if you gave the video a like. It really helps more people discover these stories. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, so you won't miss the next one. And please, take a moment to leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts, your reflections, or even a story from your own life that this reminded you of. Your voice matters here. Until next time, take care of yourself and keep listening, because the world is full of stories still waiting to be told.